Madeleine, a very striking, beautiful child. I'd almost, if I want to better phrase, call her doll-like. She'd got very pretty, very, she's a very good child too, to interact with. She was very bright. You could have a lot of fun with Madeleine.
2 men, 1 vanished girl, and a silence that lasted decades. David Payne, the friend who made an inappropriate gesture about Madeleine McCann. Gerry McCann, the father who asked that very man to check on his daughter the night she disappeared. What happened in apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m.? Why did Payne repeat his alibi over and over? And why did forensic dogs react days later to that exact same area? This is not about one man's mistake. This is about collusion, control, and a cover-up that may have started long before that night. They were in this together. On the evening of May 3, 2007, in the quiet resort town of Praia da Luz, Portugal, Gerry McCann had a tennis lesson scheduled as part of the family's holiday activities. It was meant to be a relaxing hour, a break from the demands of parenting 3 young children under the age of 4. But what transpired during that hour, particularly around 6:30 p.m., would later be scrutinized in microscopic detail, not because of what was seen, but because of what may have been overlooked. According to testimony reviewed in the investigation, Gerry McCann asked his close friend David Payne to stop by the apartment and check on his wife Kate and the children. On the surface, the request seemed harmless, even considerate, a father entrusting a friend with a brief visit to ensure everything was in order back at the apartment. But as the case deepened and statements began to diverge, that single decision started to look less like a gesture of trust and more like a red flag waving in plain sight. Gerry's tennis session reportedly lasted 1 hour. During that time, Payne walked over to apartment 5A, where Kate McCann was inside, having just stepped out of the shower. Their 3 children, Madleen, age 3, and the 2-year-old twins, Sean and Amelie, were seated alone in the living room, drinking milk and eating snacks. The children were reportedly unsupervised while their mother was bathing. What is striking, in hindsight, is not only the timing of the visit, but the conflicting versions of why it happened at all. Multiple accounts of Payne's presence at the apartment were recorded, and yet none of them match. In one version, Payne saw Gerry at the tennis court, and Gerry asked him to stop by the apartment to ask Kate if it would be all right for him to extend his tennis session. In another account, Payne was allegedly asked to see whether Kate needed help bringing the children down to the recreational area. And in yet another, Payne himself stated that he simply popped his head in to say hello, that he was never asked by Gerry to check on anything. 3 people, 3 accounts, 3 different reasons for one visit, none of them consistent. When the testimonies surrounding a key timeline moment fail to align, investigators must ask were the inconsistencies due to faulty memory, or something more deliberate. In this case, those discrepancies don't just raise eyebrows, they fracture the timeline, especially considering that David Payne may have been the last known adult outside of the immediate family to see Madleen before she vanished. The concern deepens when we examine what Kate McCann herself later described about that early evening. According to her own account, she had showered while the children were left alone, seated on the couch. She had dressed them in pajamas, given each a glass of milk and a biscuit, and left them unattended while she washed. For many, this decision was troubling. Leaving toddlers with glassware and food without supervision, especially while bathing, would be considered a risk, particularly for someone with medical training. The risk of choking, spills, or falls is not theoretical with children that age. Yet, what's more alarming isn't the parenting decision, it's the timing of it. David Payne arrived at the apartment just after Kate exited the bathroom. This meant that Payne was potentially alone in the apartment with 3 small children, and a mother who was either still dressing or just finished doing so. And that interaction, described in later statements as brief and uneventful, was recalled by Payne with unusual clarity over and over again. In fact, Payne's insistence on recounting the stop at 6:30 p.m. became a pattern. According to the case files, he referenced this visit multiple times in interviews, reiterating the timing and nature of the encounter with robotic precision. Investigators noticed the repetition. One passage observed that Payne seemed to be etching the moment into the record, deliberately reinforcing a very specific version of events, as if to ensure it was remembered exactly as he said it happened. But that raises an unsettling question. If there was nothing remarkable about the visit, why the need to emphasize it so meticulously? Why repeat it in such calculated fashion? In true crime investigations, fabricated alibis often share a trait: they are overly rehearsed. Genuine memories, particularly during chaotic events, tend to be patchy, with rough edges and forgotten details. When someone can recount a moment too cleanly, it's often not memory, it's narrative, a script. And if David Payne was reciting a script, we must ask, who helped him write it? Another troubling detail was the unusual lack of phone activity from Payne during the most crucial hours of that evening. The absence of digital communication during the key window, between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., raises further questions. While not conclusive on its own, the silence becomes harder to dismiss when paired with the inconsistencies in verbal accounts. Kate herself would later struggle to remember the precise timing of Payne's visit. For a mother who had just lost her daughter, such a visit, if innocent and brief, should have stood out as the last moment of normalcy. The fact that even she could not pin it down with clarity adds to the ambiguity. Was it truly uneventful? Or was it intentionally left vague? And then there's the broader question, the one that remains unanswered to this day. Why, of all people, did Gerry McCann choose David Payne? This wasn't just any friend. Payne was a member of the close-knit Tapas 7, the group of friends vacationing with the McCanns in Portugal. He was trusted, social, and present throughout the trip. But the dynamics of trust deserve scrutiny, especially when considering access to vulnerable individuals. In the hours before a child vanished without a trace, one man was sent alone into the apartment. His visit was undocumented, unwitnessed, and later explained in multiple conflicting ways. He emphasized it repeatedly in interviews, and then, after that night, he faded quietly from public view. That alone might not suggest wrongdoing, but paired with inconsistencies, questionable decision-making, and the absence of any concrete alibi beyond his own words, it raises a possibility investigators could never conclusively eliminate. Whether through oversight, protection, or something more complex, Gerry's decision to place Payne in that apartment at that time remains one of the most scrutinized and debated actions of the entire case. This visit, this seemingly minor event at 6:30 p.m., may be the moment where everything turned, and yet, for years, it has remained buried beneath competing narratives, media distractions, and public confusion. What happened inside that apartment? And more importantly, who already knew? Just 2 weeks after the world learned that 3-year-old Madeleine McCann had vanished from a holiday resort in Portugal, a British couple came forward with a statement that should have changed the direction of the entire investigation. Their names were Dr. Catherine Zacharias Gaspar and Dr. Arul Savio Gaspar, both medical professionals, both close enough to the McCanns to have once shared a villa with them, their children, and a group of mutual friends on vacation in Majorca, Spain. On May 16, 2007, they gave their statements to the Leicestershire police. Their testimony would introduce a troubling new element to the case. Not about the night of the disappearance, but about something that had happened 2 years earlier. And the name at the center of their concern was David Payne. Dr. Catherine Gaspar recalled an evening in September 2005, during a group holiday that included herself, her husband Arul, Kate and Gerry McCann, David and Fiona Payne, and other families with young children. On one particular night, the adults had gathered for dinner on the patio of their shared villa. Drinks flowed, conversations shifted, and laughter came easily, until a moment that Catherine would never forget. She recalled sitting between Gerry McCann and David Payne during a casual conversation about their children. At one point, Payne began referring to a situation involving Madleen. According to Catherine, while describing it, he made a series of gestures that she found inappropriate and unsettling, although the exact meaning was unclear. The tone and manner of the interaction left her with a strong sense of discomfort. The combination of the hand movement and the context in which it was delivered left her stunned. In her own words, there seemed to be an explicit insinuation about what he was saying and doing. I remember being shocked by that. Catherine wasn't the only one who saw it. Her husband Arul would later confirm that he, too, witnessed David Payne performing a similar gesture during the same trip, though he did not recall the precise context of the conversation. Still, he acknowledged that the action felt deeply inappropriate, calling it very bad taste, and noting that it lingered in his mind long after the holiday had ended. What disturbed Catherine even more was that this was not a one-time incident. She recalled seeing Payne perform a similar gesture on another occasion, possibly later during the same trip, or a few weeks afterward at a restaurant in Leicester, when the group reunited for a casual dinner. In that second instance, Payne's comments appeared to refer to his own young daughter. Catherine couldn't be sure, but the repetition of the gesture, in a different setting, suggested a pattern, one that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misplaced humor. Two similar gestures, two separate occasions, two different young girls mentioned in conversation. To Catherine, it was clear that this was not a passing moment of poor judgment. This was something she now regarded as deeply concerning, perhaps even predictive. She didn't just feel uncomfortable. She took action. During that 2005 holiday, parents had often rotated duties of bathing their children. But after what she had witnessed, Catherine no longer felt safe allowing David Payne to be alone with her child. She instructed her husband Arul to stay nearby whenever Payne volunteered to assist with the children's baths, particularly when it came to their own daughter. I was keen to stay near the bathroom. If Dave was bathing the children, I didn't trust him bathing, she recalled. This wasn't casual anxiety. This was targeted caution, based on something she had seen with her own eyes. Catherine wasn't someone given to overreaction. She was a doctor. But this was different. This was instinct colliding with experience, and she could not ignore it. Interestingly, she didn't bring this concern to the wider group during the holiday. Nor did her husband. They kept their discomfort to themselves, as many people might in a social setting, unsure how to respond, unsure whether anyone else would take them seriously. They moved on with their lives, but the memory stayed. And then, in May 2007, came the news Madeleine McCann was missing. Catherine's reaction was swift and visceral. Her thoughts went immediately, not to the parents, not to the location, but to David Payne. When I heard the terrible news regarding the disappearance of Madeleine, my thoughts raced immediately to Dave. At first, she didn't know that Payne had been present with the McCanns in Portugal. But then, she saw him on television. He was there, with them, at the resort. The same man she had long been wary of. The same man who had made those disturbing gestures about Madeleine 2 years prior. Now he was part of the search. Part of the inner circle. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Both she and her husband submitted formal statements to the Leicestershire police. They included exact descriptions of the gestures, the context, and their lingering concerns. They even provided photographs of the holiday in Majorca to establish everyone's presence. These were not vague memories. These were sworn, documented accounts with clear timelines and visual evidence. And yet, nothing happened. Despite the gravity of what had been reported, there is no record that David Payne was ever formally questioned by UK authorities regarding the Gaspar statements. No follow-up interview. No psychological assessment. No cross-examination. No effort to bring the issue to the Portuguese police, even though Payne had been present at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. This silence was not only shocking, it was deeply unsettling. For any parent, hearing such a testimony would trigger every alarm. But in the case of the McCanns, something even more perplexing emerges. According to Catherine's account, Gerry McCann was present during the initial conversation in Majorca, the one where Payne made the gesture about Madleen. Catherine saw it. She remembered looking at Gerry immediately afterward to see how he would react. He didn't object. He didn't express shock. He didn't say a word. 2 years later, on the night Madleen disappeared, it was Gerry himself who asked David Payne to go check on Kate and the children at 6:30 p.m. while he was playing tennis. Let that sink in. If Gerry had any memory of that disturbing interaction in Majorca, and according to Catherine, he was right there when it happened, why would he later entrust that same man with his daughter's presence when she was vulnerable and unsupervised? Why would he, out of all people, choose David Payne to enter that apartment? The most generous explanation is that Gerry dismissed the gesture as a tasteless joke and never thought of it again. But even that would raise questions about judgment and responsibility. The more troubling possibility is that Gerry did not find it concerning because he didn't want to. Or worse, because he already knew more than he ever let on. Whether by denial or design, Gerry maintained Payne within his trusted circle. He never publicly addressed the Gaspar testimony. Neither did Kate. And despite the statements being in the possession of police early in the investigation, they were never made central to the case. This, perhaps, is one of the greatest failures in the investigation into Madelein's disappearance. The Gaspar testimony wasn't just a red flag, it was a flare, launched directly into the sky, seen and documented, and ultimately ignored. In every case of a missing child, investigators are trained to ask who had access, who was trusted, who was nearby. David Payne checks every box. And yet the warning given about him by 2 medical professionals with no agenda was quietly filed away. For those who believe in justice, this part of the story remains one of the hardest to reconcile. What happens when the most damning clue doesn't come after the crime but before it? And worse, what does it mean when nobody listens? Between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., on May 3, 2007, events unfolded in Praia da Luz that would haunt investigators, journalists, and the public for years to come. This 4-hour period holds the key to understanding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, yet within it lies a series of contradictions, silences, and behaviors that continue to defy simple explanation. At the center of this timeline stands David Payne, a man whose movements, statements, and role in those hours have become increasingly difficult to ignore. At 6 p.m., Gerry McCann left apartment 5A to play tennis at the Ocean Club Resort. The session was scheduled to last 1 hour. In his absence, he asked David Payne, a fellow vacationer and longtime friend, to check on Kate McCann and the children. According to several accounts, David Payne arrived at the apartment around 6:30 p.m. Kate later stated she had just come out of the shower when he arrived. Inside the apartment, 3 young children, Madleen, age 3, and the twins, Amelie and Sean, age 2, were sitting in the living room, dressed in pajamas, drinking milk and eating cookies. What seemed like an ordinary moment would later raise significant questions. Payne entered the apartment during a vulnerable window. The father was gone, the mother was occupied, and the children were unsupervised. He would later describe the visit as brief and uneventful, a phrase that became a centerpiece of his repeated statements to authorities. Though Payne's visit was described as short and uneventful, his emphasis on the moment was anything but. In his official statements, he repeated the 6:30 p.m. visit numerous times with a striking consistency, down to the language and tone. He mentioned it so many times in his statements it felt like he was etching it into the record, ensuring it was acknowledged over and over like a carefully placed alibi. This level of repetition, investigators noted, is often associated with rehearsed or fabricated narratives. In genuine memories, particularly during routine or stress-filled situations, people tend to recall inconsistently or leave gaps. Payne's timeline, however, was too perfect, too fixed. Between 7 and 8:30 p.m., the families participating in the holiday, including the McCanns and the Paynes, gathered at the Tapas bar for dinner. This was part of their routine. It was familiar, social, and, at least on the surface, uneventful. At this point in the evening, there were no confirmed signs that anything was wrong. Madleen was assumed to be asleep in apartment 5A, but beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form. As the evening continued, so too did the silence around David Payne's whereabouts during the most critical moments of the case. According to multiple documents and reconstructions of the evening, no one could confirm seeing David Payne between 8:30 and 10 p.m. This 90-minute window overlaps with the time Madleen is believed to have disappeared. At approximately 9 p.m., Kate McCann reportedly went to check on the children and discovered that Madleen was missing from her bed. Panic ensued, and a search quickly began across the Ocean Club complex. But David Payne, he seemingly vanished from the timeline. There are no independent witnesses who could confirm his presence during that crucial window. No staff, no friends, no surveillance footage. In the most sensitive and significant moment of the evening, he was unaccounted for. At 9:55 p.m., a family visiting from Ireland, known as the Smith family, reported seeing a man walking swiftly through the streets of Praia da Luz. He was carrying a small child in his arms. The child, described as a girl around 3 or 4 years old, was wearing a light-colored nightgown, had bare feet, and appeared to be unconscious or asleep. The man was described as tense, walking quickly, avoiding eye contact. At the time, the sighting drew little attention. But months later, the Smiths saw footage of Gerry McCann carrying one of his own children off an airplane. The way he carried the child, the posture, the hand placement, the rhythm, matched what Mr. Smith had seen that night. This raised a chilling possibility. If the Smith sighting was legitimate, it could have taken place in the very window when Payne was also unaccounted for. 2 men, 1 child missing. A 90-minute vacuum in both their timelines. Was Payne involved directly or covering for someone else? Perhaps the most glaring absence of all came not from witnesses, but from data. At the most critical moments, there was an eerie silence, no calls, no texts. It's as if he vanished from communication right when it mattered most. In 2007, mobile phones routinely left digital trails, calls, texts, GPS signals, cell tower pings. Yet David Payne's phone showed no activity for the entirety of May 3. No messages, no calls, no location data. It was as if he had chosen, consciously or otherwise, to remove himself from digital visibility. There is no official explanation for this. No indication that his phone was left behind, powered off, or damaged. In the absence of reason, investigators and observers alike are left with the most logical conclusion. Payne either deliberately avoided digital traceability, or was not where he should have been. Once the alarm was raised, David Payne reappeared, not as a panicked friend, but as a commanding figure. Payne didn't just join in, he took charge. He gave orders, directed people, appeared deeply concerned. Unlike others, Payne did not appear visibly shocked. He didn't stumble, he didn't break down. According to witnesses, he moved efficiently, calmly, even strategically. This demeanor, to some, was commendable. To others, it was disturbing. There was a sense that Payne wasn't reacting to chaos. He was managing it. Some witnesses said his behavior felt rehearsed, too controlled. As if he knew what was coming. Even more unusual was Payne's fixation during the early searches. While others scattered in different directions, Payne repeatedly focused on the pool area and the outer perimeter of the Ocean Club complex. At first this seemed like a logical place to check, but then the search dogs reacted. Specialist sniffer dogs trained to detect the scent of human remains and blood were later brought in. They reacted exactly where Payne had been most focused, near the pool, along the fringes of the complex. Was it coincidence? Was it intuition? Or was it foreknowledge? From 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., David Payne moves in and out of the narrative with surgical precision. He arrives just as Kate exits the shower. He disappears just as Madleen vanishes. He returns just in time to take command. There are no calls, no texts, no clear witnesses, only behavior that, piece by piece, begins to form the outline of someone who was either too lucky or too informed. In cases of missing children, timelines are sacred. Every minute matters. Every movement, every ping, every glance must be accounted for. And in this case, The man closest to those missing hours remains surrounded by silence. The canine forensic evidence uncovered in the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance continues to raise disturbing and unresolved questions. Of particular concern are the multiple alerts given by a specially trained cadaver dog in key areas tied directly to the McCann family, and the broader implications these alerts may carry when viewed in conjunction with David Payne's access to the apartment. In the bedroom of apartment 5A, where Madleen was believed to have last slept, the cadaver dog gave a strong alert near the corner of the room, the precise spot associated with Madeleen's sleeping area. This was not a generic signal. The reaction was immediate and targeted, suggesting that the scent of human decomposition had at some point been present in that room. For many investigators, this was one of the earliest signs that the case might not be a straightforward abduction, as initially reported. Even more troubling was the alert in the living room area. The dog reacted near a wardrobe in the corner of the room, a space that would normally be considered mundane, but not if a body, or an item in close contact with a body, had briefly been stored there. This reaction suggested a potential intermediate location, possibly used during a hurried effort to manage the scene. It implied premeditation or, at the very least, reactive concealment. Perhaps the most shocking alert occurred in the trunk of the Renault Scenic, the rental car hired by the McCanns 24 days after Madleen was reported missing. Despite the gap in time, the dog reacted strongly to the interior of the trunk. The implication here was explosive. Forensic specialists agree that cadaver scent is not easily transferred. It typically requires prolonged or direct exposure to a deceased body. The question thus became, how did the smell of decomposition make its way into a vehicle that was not even present at the time of Madeleen's disappearance? Adding to the growing unease, another alert was triggered by a piece of clothing, specifically, a shirt worn by Kate McCann during the early days of the investigation. Once again, the cadaver dog responded as though it had detected the scent of a deceased individual. While no visible signs of contamination were present, this discovery pushed investigators to reconsider how close certain individuals had come to a potential scene of death, or to objects that had been in such proximity. While the cadaver alerts were disturbing in isolation, the introduction of blood detection brought another dimension to the case. A separate dog, trained to detect human blood, reacted under the tiles near the same bedroom corner, where the cadaver dog had earlier alerted. What makes this detail particularly damning is the fact that the blood was not visible to the human eye. It was only detected after lifting tiles and inspecting beneath the surface. DNA analysis was conducted on the blood samples retrieved from beneath the tile. The results showed a match to Madeleine McCann in 15 out of 19 genetic markers, a statistically significant correlation that strongly suggests the blood belonged to her. While not legally definitive, the probability that this sample came from a different individual within the same genetic pool was considered extremely low. This brings the investigation to a critical question: who had access to that space, and who could have left such evidence behind without detection? The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. There were no broken locks, no jimmied windows, no obvious signs of a stranger having forced their way in. Whoever caused the blood evidence to appear and subsequently managed to clean it thoroughly enough to evade human detection would have had to be familiar with the space. Not just familiar, but trusted. Someone whose presence in the apartment would not raise suspicions. Someone with time, access, and the confidence to alter the scene without interruption. This narrows the field to two types of people: those who lived in apartment 5A and those invited in by the occupants. That brings David Payne into sharp focus. On the evening of May 3, 2007, David Payne was the only adult male, aside from Gerry McCann himself, who had verifiable access to the apartment shortly before Madleen disappeared. Gerry, as documented in multiple accounts, left for his tennis session around 6 p.m., giving David Payne a specific and unmonitored window in which to visit the apartment under the pretext of checking on Kate and the children. According to various statements, Payne arrived around 6:30 p.m., just as Kate exited the bathroom. The children were alone, seated on the couch in their pajamas, having snacks. This timeline, paired with the forensic alerts, is impossible to ignore. The very area where David Payne had been present, the children's sleeping quarters, later became the site of both cadaver and blood dog reactions. Moreover, Payne's own statements about that visit were curiously consistent. He reiterated the timing and nature of the visit with almost mechanical repetition in his police interviews. It was a brief and uneventful check-in, he said multiple times, using the same phrasing. For seasoned investigators, this kind of repetition is often a red flag. Genuine memory, particularly from a chaotic or traumatic night, tends to be fuzzy, non-linear, imperfect. Rehearsed statements, however, come off too clean, too precise. Then there is the eerie coincidence that Payne disappeared from independent observation between 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., the critical window during which Madleen is believed to have vanished. There are no confirmed sightings of him during this time, and cell phone records reportedly show no activity from him on May 3. In an era where phones constantly ping towers, this absence of data is itself a data point. It suggests deliberate silence. Finally, Payne's behavior during the search for Madleen also attracted scrutiny. He was not merely assisting, he was giving directions, orchestrating efforts, behaving with an odd sense of control. Witnesses later noted that he focused particularly on areas near the swimming pool, regions that were later identified as locations where search dogs had reacted. Why direct people there? Why be so assertive, so focused, so oddly composed? Some theories suggest that it was an attempt to manage the narrative, to guide the search away from more dangerous truths, or perhaps to appear helpful in a way that would throw off suspicion. But paired with the forensic findings, these behavioral anomalies take on new significance. In cases involving concealed harm or deliberate staging, it is not uncommon for those involved to participate in the cleanup or to control the flow of attention in the aftermath. The ability to touch a scene, to move a body, to scrub a surface, to relocate evidence, these are privileges not afforded to an outsider. They require trust, invitation, familiarity. In the Madeleine McCann case, the scientific and circumstantial evidence points not toward a stranger in the night, but toward someone already inside, or someone who walked through the door with a trusted smile and left behind more questions than answers. On the evening of May 3, 2007, David Payne offered a timeline so detailed, so structured, that investigators found themselves suspicious of just how seamless it appeared. From 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., Payne outlined nearly every movement, every interaction, and every minute accounted for. He noted the exact time he visited the McCann apartment, 6:30 p.m., allegedly to check on Kate and the children while Gerry McCann was at his tennis lesson. He recalled that the visit was brief and uneventful, a phrase he would repeat nearly verbatim in multiple statements. Payne did not simply recall the visit. He etched it into the timeline. The 6:30 p.m. check-in became a pillar in his narrative, solid, immovable. He claimed he entered the apartment, saw Kate just out of the shower, and observed the three children in their pajamas eating snacks, calm, normal, quiet. Then, he said, he left. Over and over, the exact same phrasing. Brief and uneventful. It was as though the description had been rehearsed, as though it had been tested against possible contradictions, and then cemented into place. Later that night, Payne recalled his presence at dinner in the Tapas bar, alongside the McCanns and the rest of their vacationing group, known publicly as the Tapas 7. He described the timing of the meal. When each parent got up to check on their children, the moment someone noticed Madleen missing. His story included an almost minute-by-minute breakdown of his actions, each one placed neatly into a timeline that left little room for doubt or uncertainty. But therein lay the problem. No independent witness can confirm Payne's whereabouts from 8:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. There was no record, no camera footage, no phone activity, and most crucially, no independent witness who could verify Payne's exact location. His alibi during this window existed only through the statements of those within the Tapas 7. Outside that circle, the silence was deafening. This absence of confirmation raised difficult questions. If Payne had truly remained at dinner the entire time, why could no hotel staff, no other guests, no verifiable trace confirm it? In an age where digital footprints are rarely clean, Payne left none, no text, no call, no ping. Such invisibility during the very window in which Madleen is believed to have disappeared was not simply a gap. It was a void. And within that void, suspicion settled. The same protection around Gerry McCann's timeline. Gerry McCann, too, had a timeline bolstered and reinforced by the Tapas group. His evening, according to the collective narrative, included a tennis session followed by dinner. He was, they said, present, relaxed, social, until panic took hold when Madleen was reported missing. But much like Payne's account, Gerry's timeline emerged only after the group had had time to speak, reflect, and perhaps agree upon a version of events. According to investigative notes, there were delays between the event and the individual interviews. Some members of the group even returned to the UK before offering detailed statements. Each member seemed to support the other's stories with surprising cohesion. The Tapas 7's version of that night moved like a symphony. No one missed a beat. No one contradicted another's rhythm. A timeline too smooth, signs of rehearsal. The investigators noted something unsettling. When the same timestamps appeared repeatedly in separate interviews, 1830, 2030, 21, it began to feel artificial. The consistency was too rigid, the language too uniform. In one document, an officer wrote, he mentioned it so many times in his statements it felt like he was etching it into the record, ensuring it was acknowledged over and over like a carefully placed alibi. It's a tactic not unfamiliar in cases involving multiple suspects. Repeating the same narrative with calculated precision can be a defense strategy, an attempt to build an unassailable timeline. But when that precision becomes robotic, it loses credibility. Genuine memory is messy. Real trauma distorts time. But Payne's memory was crisp, down to the minute. A group agreement to avoid charges of negligence. In the aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance, public outrage focused heavily on the parents and their friends. Leaving young children alone in unlocked apartments each night, while dining at a nearby restaurant, struck many as irresponsible at best, and criminally negligent at worst. This scrutiny led to a theory among Portuguese investigators. The Tapas 7, aware that they might face charges of child endangerment, closed ranks. By aligning their stories, they could present a consistent narrative of regular check-ins and responsible behavior. And this theory fit, up to a point. But something else lurked beneath the surface. Two men with more to hide than the rest. While the group may have worked to protect itself from accusations of negligence, two individuals, David Payne and Gerry McCann, appeared to be operating with an added layer of calculation. David Payne, as noted in multiple statements, was the last non-family member to be confirmed as having seen Madleen alive. His visit to apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m. placed him in proximity to the child just hours before she vanished. This visit, while described as uneventful, was also carefully defended, over and over again. Gerry McCann, according to his own statement, left for tennis around 6 p.m., allowing Payne access to his family's apartment in his absence. This delegation of access is not suspicious on its own, but in the context of later developments, it raises uncomfortable questions. Why allow a friend, whose past behavior had raised concern in others, to enter your home alone with your children, while your wife had just stepped out of the shower? Why were both men so emphatic in anchoring their timelines? Why, in a case plagued by uncertainty, were two people so thoroughly accounted for, and yet so difficult to independently confirm? Ultimately, the question remains, was the Tapas 7 timeline a shield? A collective attempt to block legal blowback for a shared failure? Or was it a facade, designed to protect not just against guilt by negligence, but guilt of a more direct nature? Because when the details are too perfect, when every moment is spoken with the same words, the same inflection, the same placement in time, it begins to feel less like truth and more like strategy. In the search for Madeleine McCann, The world has been forced to contend not just with what happened, but with what was said afterward. And in the hours between 6 and 10 p.m., on that warm night in Praia da Luz, too much was said too perfectly, by those who should have been the most disoriented. Sometimes, the most well-rehearsed stories are the ones that demand the hardest questions. In the nearly 2 decades since Madeleine McCann disappeared, public scrutiny has naturally shifted toward her parents, their behavior, the forensic inconsistencies, and the timeline lapses. But embedded quietly beneath it all lies a far less visible, but equally significant question: why has no one from the Tapas 7 ever broken ranks? 7 adults, each intelligent, educated, and mostly trained in medicine, remained strikingly consistent in their recollection of a chaotic night. Not a single contradictory account, not one deviation, not even a moment of doubt, publicly voiced, in cases of criminal investigations involving multiple witnesses. Minor discrepancies are not just expected, they're considered healthy indicators of truth. When every version is perfectly aligned, rehearsed even, investigators begin to wonder whether the silence is natural or manufactured. This eerie unity leads to a larger, darker question. Was their silence born out of loyalty to friends, or fear of something deeper? The Tapas 7 were not ordinary tourists. Most were doctors or professionals with careers tied to institutional reputation. A public rupture in their version of events would not merely raise eyebrows, it could spark investigations, lawsuits, and career ruin. In the UK's professional circles, particularly within medicine, allegations tied to negligence or misconduct involving children carry reputational consequences that often extend beyond legal boundaries. To admit they were negligent, leaving their toddlers unattended for hours while dining and drinking, could be seen as confessing to a form of child endangerment. But to hint at something more, to suggest a cover-up or knowledge of a deeper crime, that would implode lives. So perhaps their silence was a wall of mutual protection. Not necessarily an admission of guilt, but a shield against scandal. If one spoke, the entire construct could collapse, and the professional lives of every member of the Tapas 7 would never recover. In the years following the tragedy, many members of the group returned to quiet lives. Some had children of their own. To become a whistleblower in the most watched child disappearance case in the world would invite unrelenting media attention, potential legal battles, and social ostracism. The British press is unkind to outliers. A parent who dares to accuse another, or even contradict the dominant narrative, might not only face backlash, but also trauma inflicted on their own children. Playground whispers, online attacks, schoolyard accusations. Some may have felt that silence was a lesser evil. Fear of tearing apart their families may have far outweighed the moral weight of breaking rank. Then comes the darker theory, more difficult to prove, yet disturbingly plausible. What if someone within the group held power over the others? Let us assume for a moment that David Payne, as alluded to in Gaspar's disturbing letter, had a history of inappropriate behavior. Let us further assume, hypothetically, that 1 or 2 others in the group suspected it, or knew. Now imagine that Gerry McCann, a close friend and organizer of the vacation, was aware too. If something had happened to Madleen, either by accident or worse, and if Payne had a role in it, the dynamic within the group would change entirely. One person's knowledge becomes another's liability. In such a setup, silence becomes currency. One word from one member could expose another, not just in this case, but for past conduct. Mutual destruction becomes the invisible leash, and perhaps it wasn't threats. Perhaps it was a calculated, unspoken understanding. You don't destroy me. I don't destroy you. This is not conspiracy for the sake of drama. It is a real behavioral model recognized in cases involving institutional silence, church scandals, hospital cover-ups, even police corruption. Once a shared secret enters a group dynamic, all loyalties bend around it. Though not publicly confirmed, it is not impossible that members of the Tapas 7 were advised, if not legally instructed, to maintain narrative cohesion. Under the intense media storm, legal teams were mobilized swiftly, statements were taken, Lawyers were assigned. Media consultants prepped interviews. Could there have been confidentiality agreements? Mutual advisories to not discuss the case? Perhaps. While no direct evidence confirms such arrangements, the flawless synchronization of silence across multiple people for nearly 20 years strains the limits of coincidence. To be fair, trauma does strange things to people. Memory fragments, minds self-protect. A group that undergoes a collective tragedy may cling to a single version of reality not out of guilt, but survival. If they truly believe in the innocence of their friends, or desperately need to believe it, they may refuse to even consider alternate possibilities. But what if two of them know more? What if one of them saw something, or helped cover it up? And if so, why still protect them now? Silence can be noble. It can also be damning. If there was nothing to hide, wouldn't at least one of them have come forward by now? Not with accusation, but with doubt, with honesty, with conflict. Instead, the narrative remains frozen in place, exactly as it was told in 2007. Not a single member of the Tapas 7 has ever broken ranks. No public fallouts, no second thoughts, no leaks. And so, we are left to ask, was this silence forged in loyalty or fear? Fear of being charged with neglect, fear of reputational destruction, or fear that breaking the silence would unravel a darker truth, one that someone, somewhere, is still desperate to keep buried. Until someone speaks, the silence will always be louder than words. In the crucial early hours following Madeleine McCann's disappearance, a pattern emerged that puzzled observers, not in the forensics nor in the timeline, but in the behavior of the missing child's father. Gerry McCann, a man at the center of one of the most heavily scrutinized child disappearance cases in modern history, exhibited an emotional detachment that sparked more questions than answers. Witnesses and investigators have documented that in those first critical hours, when panic, confusion, and visible grief would be the expected response, Gerry McCann displayed none of those reactions. Instead, multiple accounts paint a picture of a man who stepped back, allowing his wife Kate to take the emotional forefront. Whether during conversations with friends, discussions with police, or press interactions, Gerry's role was strangely passive. One documented incident reveals that during an early media interview, meant to plea for public help, Gerry left Kate to handle the emotional appeals alone. He remained in the background, either watching silently or stepping away entirely. His disengagement stood out. A parent in genuine shock might stumble over words or break down in front of cameras. Gerry, however, showed a calmness that bordered on calculated control. This behavior, particularly the absence of frantic action or visible emotional turmoil, did not go unnoticed. It was not simply a case of private grief. Observers repeatedly noted his apparent decision to manage, rather than express. The unease wasn't confined to public perception. People close to the situation that night voiced their own disquiet. One eyewitness recounted seeing Gerry shortly after the disappearance was reported. His assessment was simple yet stark. He looked like he was in control, not in shock. This assessment didn't come from idle speculation. It stemmed from watching his composed body language and precise words during a moment that should have shattered even the strongest emotional defenses. Others described how he shifted from one conversation to the next, not with the desperation of a man searching for answers, but with the resolve of someone protecting a strategy. To be clear, not every parent reacts to trauma in the same way. Some freeze, some disassociate. But what made Gerry's reactions remarkable was not just his composure, it was its consistency. Through interviews, public statements, and behind-the-scenes planning, the mask never seemed to slip. Following the initial chaos, Gerry assumed a new role: information gatekeeper. While Kate often appeared fragile and visibly distraught in public appearances, Gerry remained composed and meticulously calculated. He organized high-profile press conferences and managed the couple's media presence with professional precision. He personally approved requests, liaised with PR advisors, and curated the family's messaging to the world. They launched the Madleen Fund, developed a website, and engaged in coordinated campaigns with international appeal. But behind the polished image lay a growing unease. Investigators and journalists alike began noticing patterns. Interviews were strategically timed. Selective narratives emerged. Photographers were managed, and even off-the-record conversations were carefully shaped to support the family's broader storyline. When uncomfortable questions arose about parenting choices, timeline inconsistencies, or even suspicions raised in Portugal, Gerry reportedly became defensive, sometimes dismissive. Rather than openness, there was control. Rather than vulnerability, there was framing. And for many, that was a red flag, not necessarily of guilt, but of guarded knowledge. In criminal psychology, there's a recurring insight often taught to profilers: the reaction to trauma can reveal the proximity of a person to the crime. Individuals who are innocent but uninformed typically exhibit confusion, impulsiveness, or exaggerated expressions of hope. Those who know, or strongly suspect, the outcome tend to behave differently. Their reactions are rehearsed, their faces still, their responses curiously out of sync with the chaos around them. Gerry's demeanor seemed to match the latter. He was not stumbling through grief, he was managing it. He wasn't speculating about Madeleine's fate in despair. He seemed to act as if the final outcome was already known. The implication isn't that he was the perpetrator. No evidence proves that. But the hypothesis many have entertained is that Gerry may have known, from early on, that Madeleine was never coming back. That knowledge changes everything. It transforms the role of a desperate father into a controlled messenger. It turns the act of searching into the act of protecting an image, a marriage, or perhaps someone else's secret. There's an unsettling conclusion that some investigators and journalists have floated. If Gerry didn't harm Madeleine, he may have known or believed she was harmed by someone he knew. Worse yet, he may have accepted, early on, that she would never return, not because she vanished without a trace, but because the trace had already been erased. From the earliest days, certain actions suggested finality. The decision to hire media advisors so quickly, the refusal to allow police full access to phone records, the aggressive legal threats to journalists raising uncomfortable theories. And of course, the silence around David Payne, a man Kate and Gerry allowed to remain in their circle, even after being the subject of disturbing allegations by Dr. Catherine Gaspar. If someone hurt Madeleine between 1830 and 2030 that night, Gerry's behavior could be interpreted not as a reaction to shock, but as part of a containment strategy. That includes protecting Kate, Payne, or even the Tapas 7 from further scrutiny, not out of malice, but perhaps out of fear, loyalty, or a sense of shared responsibility. The story of Madeleine McCann has always been haunted by the absence of certainty. Yet the actions of those closest to her offer clues, not just in what they said, but in what they didn't. Gerry McCann's stoic exterior, his grip on the narrative, and his avoidance of personal breakdown all suggest a man who wasn't just grieving. He was preparing. For what? We may never know. But it is this composure, in the eye of a storm no parent should withstand, that continues to raise the quiet, troubling question: was he already certain, from the very beginning, that Madeleine would never come home? When Madeleine McCann disappeared on the night of May 3, 2007, from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal, the world was transfixed. Among the many questions raised in the aftermath, one thread has remained persistently underexplored: the quiet, almost complete disappearance of David Payne from public view, and the remarkable silence that surrounded him, from his friends, from the media, and most intriguingly, from the McCanns themselves. Following the initial shock and chaos of the case, David Payne, one of the closest family friends and the last known adult outside the McCanns to see Madeleine, effectively vanished from public life. He did not participate in media interviews. He offered no public statements to dispute or clarify the growing questions about his timeline, his proximity to the children that evening, or the unsettling content of the Gaspar statement submitted to police by a fellow doctor. Nor did Payne appear in the various global campaigns fundraising drives, or public appeals that followed, efforts in which others, including the McCanns, were heavily involved. He did not attend forums, conferences, or panels on child protection or the case, despite being one of the core adult figures present during the fateful vacation. For someone who had been a key witness, his complete retreat from visibility became more conspicuous as time passed. Some might argue his silence was the result of legal advice or trauma. Yet over 15 years have elapsed. Still, Payne has not spoken, not even to refute the troubling allegations that arose early in the investigation. In the vacuum left by his silence, speculation only deepens. His vanishing act has become not just a curiosity, but a potential clue. While Payne retreated, Gerry McCann stepped forward. From the earliest days after Madeleen's disappearance, Gerry assumed the role of lead communicator for the family. He was not just speaking to the press, he was orchestrating a message. He appointed professional PR firms, legal advisors, and media handlers to ensure that the family's image was tightly managed. Especially amid growing criticism over the couple's decision to leave their children alone in the apartment that night. From launching the official Find Madleen campaign to managing a website and social media presence, Gerry ensured every aspect of the family's public narrative was curated. Interviews were vetted, journalists were warned, legal threats were issued to media outlets that published content the family considered defamatory or speculative. Notably, this control extended beyond defending the family from unfair blame. It included deflecting or minimizing scrutiny around individuals like David Payne. Despite being the last visitor to apartment 5A before Madleen vanished, Payne's name was seldom brought up in media appearances or public updates. If he was mentioned at all, it was in passing, never as a person of interest, never with a trace of doubt. The narrative was clear: the McCanns were victims. Their friends were loyal, and the enemy was elsewhere. One of the most puzzling elements of the case is the complete solidarity exhibited by the so-called Tapas 7, the group of friends vacationing with the McCanns. Despite inconsistencies in the timeline, the controversy over the child monitoring system, and unusual behavioral patterns, not a single member has publicly challenged the core account. None of the Tapas 7, not Jane Tanner, Matthew Oldfield, Russell O'Brien, nor the others have questioned David Payne's statements or expressed doubts about Gerry's actions. This silence becomes even more concerning when viewed in light of the Gaspar statement, in which Catherine Gaspar described witnessing Payne make inappropriate gestures about Madleen in front of Gerry during a previous vacation. Still, none of the friends have publicly addressed that statement. No one asked, "Is this man safe around children?" Not even privately, at least not in any record available to the public. This kind of airtight unity is rare in real-life friendships. People disagree. They see things differently. Yet here, the group has remained immovable, even as their collective silence draws scrutiny. Legally, the case has gone nowhere. Gerry and Kate McCann were officially declared arguidos, formal suspects, by Portuguese police for a time, but this status was lifted without charges. David Payne, despite being mentioned in police files and witness statements, was never charged. No member of the Tapas group has faced prosecution, or even civil inquiries, related to Madeleen's disappearance. And yet, troubling indicators remain: unresolved cadaver dog alerts in apartment 5A and the McCann's rental car, DNA results showing partial matches to Madleen under the apartment floor, and Payne's unverified location during critical hours that evening. Taken together, these fragments form a picture that feels incomplete, not because there isn't enough to question, but because none of it has been satisfactorily explained. For a case of this magnitude, the absence of any definitive accountability stands in stark contrast to the depth of suspicion. A theory persists within some investigative circles that Gerry and Payne are bound not by guilt, but by knowledge. One version suggests David Payne may not have harmed Madleen himself, but he witnessed something incriminating. Alternatively, Gerry may possess information about Payne's behavior with children, possibly including the events described in the Gaspar report. In this scenario, both men hold secrets. both are vulnerable. Both have incentive to maintain silence and to protect each other. This would explain Gerry's decision to send Payne to the apartment that evening. It might also explain Payne's overly rehearsed statements to police and his vanishing act after the media storm. If either man betrays the other, they both risk exposure. It's a fragile but potent equilibrium, a mutual deterrence theory that fits the facts as well as any. Over the years, investigators, journalists, and thousands of online sleuths have returned to a fundamental question. Why has no one from the Tapas 7 broken ranks? Why has no one pointed a finger? Is it out of loyalty, fear, or something else? Is the silence a shield to protect themselves from charges of child neglect, as some claim? Or is it protecting something darker? Some theorists argue that the silence was bought not necessarily with money, but with legal support, career incentives, or social pressure. After all, many in the group were professionals with reputations to protect. A public rupture in the narrative could ruin careers, marriages, and even lives. Others believe the silence is born of guilt, not of a crime, but of knowing something terrible and doing nothing to stop it. In the end, silence can serve many masters: fear, shame, protection, and complicity. And silence is what has prevailed. Nearly 2 decades have passed since Madeleine McCann vanished from a quiet resort in Portugal. Her image still haunts posters, and her name still resonates in global headlines. But amid all the noise, the silence of one man, David Payne, and the unwavering support of another, Gerry McCann, remain the most deafening echoes of all. Not one person has been charged. Not one person has confessed. And yet, the public instinct tells us something happened that night, and someone still knows.